Until the end of 1941, the world's eyes were fixed on the Western Front, on the desperate battles across Europe and North Africa. But almost overnight, in 1942, the conflict changed. It took on a truly global dimension, erupting violently across the vast expanse of the Pacific. This seismic shift, of course, was triggered by the surprise attack on the American Navy at Pearl Harbor. The Empire of the Rising Sun had awakened what its own leaders feared most, a sleeping giant. Yet the immediate reality was one of Japanese triumph. The Pacific Theater became a stage for a real escalation of Japanese power. Japan was ruthlessly expanding its sphere of influence, pushing north toward the American West Coast and south toward Australia. Their expansionism seemed utterly irresistible. The months following Pearl Harbor were marked by what felt like an endless string of Allied defeats, a nightmarish prospect for the British and Americans. The Japanese conquests were swift and total. They were masters of crucial strategic areas, including Malaysia, Thailand, the Dutch East Indies, and most of Burma. America, at the same time, was losing military bases of strategic importance and was on the brink of losing the entire Philippines. The Allies had reached the abyss. It seemed nothing could prevent the Empire of the Rising Sun from dominating the Pacific entirely. But while Japanese soldiers paused, confident in their easy hold on these new territories, the stunned Allies were already mobilizing for a counterattack. Days after the Pearl Harbor attack, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill flew to Washington to coordinate strategy with President Roosevelt. In an unforgettable speech, he asserted the Allies' intractable determination to crush the enemy. The two powers, soon joined by Stalin, were united against the Axis, finally offering a real hope of victory. The tide of history demanded vengeance, and the stage was set for the Pacific to ignite. The initial shock of Pearl Harbor rapidly gave way to the paralyzing fear of total collapse. Nowhere was this feeling more acute than in Singapore. For decades, it had been held up as the strategic bedrock of British power in the East, an impregnable fortress whose vast, westward-facing guns stood ready to repel any naval assault from the sea. Yet the Japanese exposed a catastrophic flaw. They simply marched down the Malaysian peninsula. General Yamashita's forces, often traveling by bicycle and expertly navigating the jungle, bypassed the fixed defenses entirely. The resulting defeat was not merely tactical, it was a profound psychological blow. On February 15, 1942, over 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops were forced to surrender, marking the single largest capitulation in British military history. The world watched, stunned as a colonial empire crumbled. Confirming that Japan's success was no fluke, it was a devastating reality. Simultaneously, America was losing its strategic foothold in the Philippines. While the defense led by General Douglas MacArthur was spirited, the overwhelming Japanese naval and air superiority made resistance futile. Manila fell quickly, and the remnants of the Allied forces were driven into the rugged terrain of the Bataan Peninsula. The loss of these key outposts, Singapore, the symbolic shield of Britain, and the Philippines, the crucial gateway to American defense, reinforced the darkest point of the narrative. The Allies were not simply retreating, they were being systematically ejected from the Pacific, facing a crisis that demanded immediate and violent vengeance. The fall of the Philippines was sealed with the surrender of U.S. and Filipino troops at Bataan in April 1942, followed shortly by the final holdout on Corregidor. Roughly 75,000 men became prisoners of war, and what followed was a chapter of such unspeakable horror that it instantly hardened the Allied resolve and provided the fuel for a campaign of total, unyielding vengeance. This was the infamous Bataan Death March. Stripped of dignity and driven by their captors, the starving, sick, and wounded prisoners were forced to march 65 miles in scorching heat. The treatment was barbaric. Those who stumbled, fell out of line, or simply asked for water were beaten, bayoneted, or instantly shot. Japanese soldiers, imbued with a harsh martial code that saw surrender as the ultimate disgrace, inflicted deliberate cruelty, often executing men simply for sport. This was not a military blunder, it was a deliberate campaign of terror. When news of the atrocities finally reached the American public, the resulting moral outrage was immediate and overwhelming. The tales of starvation, brutality, and mass execution transformed the war in the Pacific from a geopolitical conflict to a moral crusade. The Japanese Empire was not just an enemy to be defeated, it was a force of evil that had to be crushed without mercy. The cry for retaliation became the rallying call across the nation, forging a collective, emotional vengeance that would sustain the brutal campaigns ahead. The Allied resolve to crush the Japanese forces already strong was now immutable. With the Allies backed into a corner, suffering one crushing defeat after another, President Franklin Roosevelt recognized that the crisis was as much psychological as it was military. The American public was reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor and the agony of the Bataan Death March. What was desperately needed was a powerful, symbolic victory, something that would shatter the perception of Japanese invulnerability and inject a massive dose of hope back into the American consciousness. The problem was simple. How do you strike at the heart of an empire protected by thousands of miles of ocean? The solution, though audacious, was elegant: a raid on Tokyo. Roosevelt, determined to show the Japanese high command and the world that the United States could hit back hard, championed a plan that seemed utterly impossible: launch Army bombers from Navy carriers. This was not about inflicting massive physical damage, it was a move of pure psychological warfare. The true target was not Tokyo's infrastructure, but the Japanese leadership's overconfidence. This single, bold initiative marked the critical turning point in the narrative, shifting the focus from enduring defeat to embracing a daring, unprecedented counteroffensive. The man tasked with executing this audacious plan was Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, an aviation legend and one of the most brilliant minds in American flight history. The problem he faced was a massive logistical challenge. Conventional bombers couldn't launch from an aircraft carrier, and Tokyo was far beyond the range of any land-based planes the Allies still held in the Pacific. How could they bridge this impossible distance? The ingenious, untested solution was a technical masterpiece of American necessity. Doolittle selected the sturdy, twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bomber, an Army land-based plane, and adapted it for Navy service. Every non-essential piece of weight was stripped out, extra fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bay, and, most critically, the planes were fitted with special modifications to handle a short carrier deck takeoff. The risk was staggering. No B-25 had ever launched from a ship, and the pilots would have to ditch or crash land their planes in China after the mission. Two key naval figures were entrusted with the carriers for this highly secret mission: the charismatic Admiral William Bull Halsey commanding the USS Enterprise, and Captain Mark Mitscher leading the USS Hornet, which carried the precious cargo of 16 B-25s. The entire mission was a monumental gamble, hinging on the calculated awe of engineering genius and the audacity of a plan that defied established military doctrine. The fate of American morale rested on whether these pilots could achieve the impossible. The two task forces, the USS Hornet bearing the bombers and the USS Enterprise providing protection, steamed in total radio silence across the frigid, turbulent North Pacific. The plan was excruciatingly precise. They would reach a point 640 nautical miles from Japan, launch the B-25s, and immediately retire before the Japanese fleet could intercept them. The entire operation was a ticking clock governed by fuel and secrecy. But on the morning of April 18, 1942, that clock violently sped up. While still over 300 kilometers short of the designated launch point, a Japanese picket boat, the Nito Maru, spotted the American carriers. A fierce naval engagement instantly ensued, but the damage was done. The picket boat managed to radio a warning to the Japanese high command. This was the moment of sudden crisis. Admiral Halsey faced a devastating choice: press forward and risk the entire carrier force, or launch the land-based bombers immediately from an unprecedented distance. Halsey chose the only way forward. In rough seas and strong headwinds, the 16 B-25s, Army planes taking off from a Navy carrier for the first time in history, were sent roaring into the sky. The mission was now even more perilous. The chance of the pilots reaching a safe landing dramatically reduced. The pacing of the war had just accelerated, forcing the Americans to make a desperate, premature gamble. Against all odds, Doolittle's audacious gamble paid off. The 16 B-25s, flying low to avoid radar detection, slipped through the coastal defenses and delivered their payload over Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The military damage was intentionally light, but the bombers faced virtually no opposition, a stunning fact that underscored the complacency of the Japanese high command. The true impact of the raid was not measured in tons of bombs, but in the immediate massive wave of satisfaction that swept through the demoralized American public. This single event delivered the critical payoff for the narrative arc of despair, signaling that America was back in the fight. In Japan, the reaction was a massive psychological shockwave. The populace had been assured that their home islands were impregnable. The thought of American planes flying over the imperial palace was an insult to national pride. The ensuing fallout was rapid and brutal. The Japanese press was censored, and the military command engaged in bitter internal reproach. One commander, responsible for the coastal defenses, was so disgraced that he reportedly committed suicide. Though the physical damage was negligible, the raid had great repercussions on Japanese decisions about their next step. The necessity of eliminating the American carriers, the source of this insolent success, became Admiral Yamamoto's overwhelming priority. The stage was now set for the decisive strategic conflict to come. The psychological cost of the Doolittle raid far outweighed the minimal physical damage. It forced a dramatic internal schism within the Japanese high command, exposing a critical intellectual value for the audience. The war's next phase hinged on a profound strategic disagreement. On one side stood Admiral Osami Nagano and the general staff. Their priority was rooted in the concept of co-prosperity, the continued methodical expansion south to secure vital resources, particularly oil, and to isolate Australia. This strategy was encapsulated in Operation Mo, the plan to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea, and the establishment of a seaplane base at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. The objective was clear and deeply threatening. If successful, Operation Mo would cut off the vital supply lines running from the United States to Australia. This action would effectively isolate a major allied nation, forcing it out of the war and solidifying Japan's dominance over the entire South Pacific. This renewed focus on expansion immediately reintroduces a feeling of imminent danger for the audience. The invasion forces, commanded by Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, steamed toward their target, confident that American forces were too battered and far away to intervene effectively. To the Japanese, the successful occupation of New Guinea seemed assured. The Doolittle raid had forced a shift in Tokyo's long-term thinking, but it had come too late to prevent this immediate, critical gambit. The race was now on to stop the invasion before Australia was pushed out of the war entirely. While Admiral Inoue's invasion fleet confidently steamed south, oblivious to danger, a massive secret was already tilting the balance of power. The single most important factor in the Pacific War turning point was not a new weapon or a brilliant tactical maneuver. It was intelligence. American and British cryptographers, working tirelessly under the banner of Ultra Program, had achieved a monumental breakthrough. They had broken the Japanese naval code, known as JN-25B. This was the critical plot point the audience needs to grasp. Every major Japanese strategic plan, including the operational details of Operation Mo, was being read in Hawaii, often within hours of being transmitted.
Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was therefore fully aware of the enemy's movements, targets, and expected dates of attack. The Japanese were meticulously planning a surprise attack, but the U.S. Navy was already waiting for them. This creates intense dramatic irony. The audience is now watching the Japanese walk blindly into a highly prepared trap. They believe they are dictating the terms of battle, but Nimitz is the one setting the stage, transforming the Allies from reactive defenders into proactive predators. This intelligence advantage meant Nimitz could gamble with near certainty, an edge that would prove decisive in the battles to come. Aware of Operation Mo, thanks to the broken codes, Admiral Nimitz rapidly mobilized a response. The Allied forces available were thin, consisting primarily of two carrier groups under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Task Force 17, centered on the veteran USS Yorktown, and Task Force 11, built around the USS Lexington. Their mission was simply to intercept and prevent the invasion of Port Moresby. The initial clash began in the Solomon Islands with a decisive American strike that wiped out the seaplane base at Tulagi, immediately putting the Japanese on alert. The ensuing Battle of the Coral Sea, fought in early May 1942, was a historic first. The world's first naval battle fought entirely without the opposing surface ships seeing or firing directly at one another. The fight was executed entirely by aircraft launched from carriers. This novelty of conflict was driven by reconnaissance and air power. The engagement quickly descended into confusion and chaos. Both sides suffered from poor scouting reports, resulting in missed opportunities and mistaken targets. The Japanese sank a U.S. tanker and a destroyer after misidentifying them as carriers. Conversely, the Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho in a devastating strike, which prompted the famous American radio call, "Scratch One Flat Top." The intensity was relentless, with squadrons from both sides searching frantically for the enemy fleet across a massive churning expanse of water, resulting in 2 days of brutal, fast-paced air-sea combat. The cost of the Coral Sea was severe. The U.S. Navy endured what appeared to be a significant tactical loss. The carrier USS Lexington, a celebrated icon of the fleet, was so severely damaged that she had to be abandoned and sunk. Furthermore, the USS Yorktown sustained heavy damage, barely limping back toward Pearl Harbor for repairs. The Japanese, having only lost the light carrier Shoho and having sustained damage to Shokaku and Zuikaku, technically won the exchange of ships and aircraft. Yet the outcome demanded a crucial reframe. The primary strategic objective of the Japanese, the invasion of Port Moresby, had failed. With the two large Japanese fleet carriers now out of commission, one heavily damaged, the other having lost too many planes, Admiral Inoue was forced to postpone the Operation Mo invasion indefinitely. This stunning reality transformed a seemingly negative outcome into a decisive strategic success. By forcing the Japanese retreat, the Allies had achieved their goal. Australia was saved from immediate invasion, and the relentless advance of the Empire of the Rising Sun in the south was finally halted. More critically, the severely damaged Japanese carriers would be unavailable for the next, much larger, planned offensive, the all-or-nothing trap, laid by Yamamoto at Midway. Nimitz had bought time, and he had secured a massive, unintended advantage for the battle to come. The Tokyo raid and the strategic defeat at the Coral Sea only solidified Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's conviction. The American carriers had to be eliminated. Empowered by the internal shockwave, he finalized his elaborate yet flawed grand design to deliver the knockout blow. The target was the Midway Atoll, a small, isolated American base, which, if captured, would effectively force the U.S. fleet out to fight on Japanese terms. Yamamoto assembled the largest armada the Japanese Navy had ever deployed, an overwhelming force meant to crush any resistance. This plan, however, was fundamentally compromised by overconfidence and a lack of unified command. He committed a fatal mistake, driven partly by the General Staff's earlier insistence. He split his massive fleet. While the main strike force led by Admiral Nagamo headed for Midway, a significant secondary force was detached to attack the Aleutian Islands in the far north. This unnecessary division of forces violated a fundamental rule of naval warfare: concentrating power. The audience is now armed with the knowledge of the broken code, recognizes the impending disaster. This creates intense dramatic irony. Yamamoto believed his overwhelming numbers ensured victory, but by dividing his strength, he was unknowingly setting the stage for a dramatic collapse, enabling the Americans to face a manageable portion of his fleet at the decisive moment. While Yamamoto's Grand Armada sailed confidently toward Midway, Nimitz already knew the precise date and location of the attack, thanks to the intelligence provided by codebreaking. The U.S. Navy was not rushing to meet an unknown threat. They were setting a perfect trap. But to spring that trap, Nimitz needed every available ship. The most pressing issue was the USS Yorktown, severely damaged just weeks earlier at the Coral Sea. The carrier limped into Pearl Harbor with a hole in the flight deck and major structural damage. In an extraordinary, nearly miraculous display of American resolve and ingenuity, the standard 3-month repair job was compressed into just 72 hours. Hundreds of shipyard workers swarmed the ship, conducting field repairs that rendered the carrier barely seaworthy, but tactically operational. This feat became an immediate proof of Allied capability and a monumental secret.
The repaired Yorktown immediately joined the two other carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, forming the 3 strike groups that would face Yamamoto. These forces were placed under the leadership of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise and Hornet. Nimitz's orders were clear. Position the 3 carriers to the northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush, hidden from Japanese reconnaissance, yet perfectly placed to intercept the enemy's main strike force. The odds were still stacked against the Americans, but they had the advantage of surprise, confidence, and the decisive element of foresight. The primary architects of the Midway operation, most notably Admiral Nagumo and Admiral Yamamoto, were crippled by a fatal strategic arrogance, a classic case of the villain's flaw. Based on the intelligence reports from the Coral Sea, they had made the tragic mistake of believing they had sunk 2 American carriers, including the USS Yorktown. This assumption fundamentally flawed their planning. Believing they would face, at most, only 2 operational American carriers, the Japanese High Command felt a paralyzing sense of overconfidence. This hubris led them to underestimate U.S. strength and capability, particularly concerning the speed of American repairs and the efficacy of their intelligence. Yamamoto sailed into the battle supremely confident that his numerically superior force would deliver a quick, decisive victory, forcing the U.S. to the peace table. He did not anticipate the full might of the 3-carrier force waiting in ambush, nor did he fully grasp the extent to which his secret plans had been compromised. This massive miscalculation, driven by pride and complacency, was the key vulnerability that Nimitz was perfectly positioned to exploit. June 4, 1942. The decisive day. The battle began as expected with a massive Japanese airstrike aimed at neutralizing the defenses on Midway Atoll. The meager U.S. Marine squadrons launched an intense, defiant counterattack from the island, suffering heavy losses but forcing Admiral Nagumo's air crews into chaos. Nagumo was forced into the fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft with land attack bombs, a process that took precious minutes. But just as the Japanese bombers were being prepared for a second strike, the American carriers launched their full strike force. The ensuing American torpedo attacks were a desperate, sacrificial act of valor. Squadrons of TBD Devastator torpedo bombers flew low and slow, pressed forward by pilots knowing they had little chance of survival. Though nearly wiped out, the attack served a crucial purpose. It drew the Japanese fighter defenses, the vaunted Vuros, down to sea level. This created a gaping vulnerability high above. In a moment of pure, blinding action climax, 2 separate waves of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived from the Enterprise and the Yorktown. They found the Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, totally exposed, with their flight decks crowded with fueled and fully armed aircraft. In a matter of 5 devastating minutes, the dive bombers plummeted from the sky, their bombs finding their targets with ruthless efficiency. The 3 carriers became burning infernos, ripped apart by explosions of their own fuel and ordnance. The tide had turned. The action climax delivered its devastating payoff. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's mightiest fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were reduced to floating scrap heaps, their decks convulsing with secondary explosions. This was a catastrophic, irrefutable consequence for the Japanese war machine. The complete annihilation of the Kido Butai, the elite strike force that had executed Pearl Harbor. But the battle was not yet over. Admiral Nagumo, refusing to surrender, managed to launch a retaliatory strike from his last operational carrier, the Hiryu. This final, desperate Japanese counterattack struck the USS Yorktown with brutal efficiency, leaving her crippled and burning, forcing Admiral Fletcher to transfer his command. However, the relentless Admiral Spruance, now in sole command, pressed his advantage with cold calculation. He launched a final, decisive strike which found and destroyed the Hiryu. With the sinking of their 4th and final carrier, the backbone of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air power was broken. Yamamoto's grand plan had failed spectacularly. The knockout blow had been delivered, not to America, but to Japan. The victory was total, ensuring the American victory and permanently reversing the fortunes of the war in the Pacific.
The strategic victory at Midway came at a terrible price for both nations. demanding a moment of sobering reality to acknowledge the cost while affirming the magnitude of the triumph. The final accounting for the Japanese Imperial Navy was catastrophic. They lost 4 fleet aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 1 heavy cruiser, and suffered the loss of approximately 2,500 experienced sailors and aviators. This included hundreds of highly trained pilots, a human capital loss the Japanese training system could never rapidly replace. The American losses, though significant, were comparatively light: 1 carrier, the USS Yorktown, and 1 destroyer, with roughly 300 men killed. The loss of the Yorktown itself was drawn out. Though crippled by air attack, she was ultimately sunk on June 7 by a fatal submarine blow while being towed back towards safety. This final tragedy served as a stark reminder of the persistent danger. Despite the sacrifice, the key takeaway was undeniable. A new balance of naval power had been decisively established, now leaning in favor of America. Japan's ability to wage long-range offensive carrier warfare had been shattered, and the U.S. Navy now possessed rough parity in carriers, with a vastly superior industrial capacity to build more. Midway was not the end of the war, but it was, irrevocably, the turning point that ensured the eventual Allied victory. Despite the monumental, history-altering victory at Midway, the war was far from over. The Japanese, even in defeat, managed a final geographically distant success. The troops dispatched to the Aleutian Islands captured Kiska and Attu, placing enemy soldiers ominously at the gates of U.S. territory. This was a stark, final reminder that the Empire of the Rising Sun still possessed immense fighting capability and territory. As President Roosevelt himself acknowledged, the Battle of Midway had halted the Japanese advance, but it had not ended the conflict. The Pacific War was truly only in its infancy. Ahead lay a campaign of attrition across the frozen, unforgiving territories of the Aleutians, and, more terrifyingly, through the impenetrable, disease-ridden jungles of New Guinea and the Solomons. The toughest fights of World War II, the desperate, brutal island-hopping campaign, were yet to come. You've just witnessed the opening chapter of the Pacific War.